History of Qatar. The state of Qatar, B, is a country in West Asia. It occupies the Qatar Peninsula on the northeastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East. It shares its sole land border with Saudi Arabia to the south, with the rest of its territory surrounded by the Persian Gulf. The Gulf of Bahrain, an inlet of the Persian Gulf, separates Qatar from nearby Bahrain. The capital is Doha, home to over 80% of the country's inhabitants, and the land area is mostly made up of flat, low-lying desert. Qatar has been ruled as a hereditary monarchy by the House of Thani since Mohammed bin Thani signed an agreement, not a formal treaty, with Britain in 1868 that recognized its separate status. Following Ottoman rule, Qatar became a British protectorate in 1916 and gained independence in 1971. The current emir is Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, who holds nearly all executive, legislative, and judicial authority in autocratic manner under the Constitution of Qatar. He appoints the Prime Minister and Cabinet. The partially elected Consultative Assembly can block legislation and has a limited ability to dismiss ministers. In early 2017, the population of Qatar was 2.6 million, although only 313,000 of them are Qatari citizens and 2.3 million being expatriates and migrant workers. 20. Its official religion is Islam. The country has the fourth highest GDP (PPP) per capita in the world and the 11th highest GNI per capita Atlas method. It ranks 42nd in the Human Development Index, the third highest HDI in the Arab world. It is a high-income economy, backed by the world's third largest natural gas reserves and oil reserves. Qatar is one of the world's largest exporters of liquefied natural gas and the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide per capita. In the 21st century, Qatar emerged as both a major non-NATO ally of the United States and a middle power in the Arab world. Its economy has risen rapidly through its resource wealth, and its geopolitical power has risen through its media group, Al Jazeera Media Network, and reported support for rebel groups financially during the Arab Spring. Qatar also forms part of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Human habitation in Qatar dates back to 50,000 years ago. Settlements and tools dating back to the Stone Age have been unearthed in the peninsula. Mesopotamian artifacts originating from the Ubaid period c. 6500-3800 BC have been discovered in abandoned coastal settlements. Al-Da'asa, a settlement located on the western coast of Qatar, is the most important Ubaid site in the country and is believed to have accommodated a small seasonal encampment. Kassite Babylonian material dating back to the 2nd millennium BC found in Al-Khor Islands attests to trade relations between the inhabitants of Qatar and the Kassites in modern-day Bahrain. Among the findings were crushed snail shells and Kassite potsherds. It has been suggested that Qatar is the earliest known site of shellfish dye production, owing to a Kassite purple dye industry which existed on the coast. In 224 AD, the Sasanian Empire gained control over the territories surrounding the Persian Gulf. Qatar played a role in the commercial activity of the Sassanids, contributing at least two commodities: precious pearls and purple dye. Citation needed. Under the Sassanid reign, many of the inhabitants in eastern Arabia were introduced to Christianity following the eastward dispersal of the religion by Mesopotamian Christians. Monasteries were constructed and further settlements were founded during this era. During the latter part of the Christian era, Qatar comprised a region known as Beth Qatre, Syriac for House of the Qataris. The region was not limited to Qatar. It also included Bahrain, Taraut Island, Al-Khat, and Al-Hassa. In 628, the Islamic prophet Muhammad sent a Muslim envoy to a ruler in eastern Arabia named Munzir ibn Sawa al-Tamimi and requested that he and his subjects accept Islam. Munzir obliged his request, and accordingly most of the Arab tribes in the region converted to Islam. In the middle of the century, the Muslim conquest of Persia resulted in the fall of the Sasanian Empire. Early and late Islamic period, 661-1783. Qatar was described as a famous horse and camel breeding center during the Umayyad period. In the 8th century, it started benefiting from its commercially strategic position in the Persian Gulf and went on to become a center of pearl trading. Substantial development in the pearling industry around the Qatari peninsula occurred during the Abbasid era. Ships voyaging from Basra to India and China would make stops in Qatar's ports during this period. Chinese porcelain, West African coins, and artifacts from Thailand have been discovered in Qatar. Archaeological remains from the 9th century suggest that Qatar's inhabitants used greater wealth to construct higher quality homes and public buildings. Over 100 stone-built houses, 2 mosques, and an Abbasid fort were constructed in Merwab during this period. When the caliphate's prosperity declined in Iraq, so too did it in Qatar. Qatar is mentioned in 13th century Muslim scholar Yaqut al-Hamawi's book, Mu'jam al-Budan, which alludes to the Qataris' fine striped woven cloaks and their skills in improvement and finishing of spears. Much of eastern Arabia was controlled by the Usafids in 1253, but control of the region was seized by the Prince of Ormus in 1320. Qatar's pearls provided the kingdom with one of its main sources of income. In 1515, Manuel I of Portugal vassalized the kingdom of Ormus. Portugal went on to seize a significant portion of eastern Arabia in 1521. In 1550, the inhabitants of Al-Hassa voluntarily submitted to the rule of the Ottomans, preferring them to the Portuguese. Portuguese era. After the fall of the Jabrid dynasty with the conquest of Bahrain by the Portuguese, the Arabian coast up to Al-Hassa came under the rule and influence of the Portuguese Empire. Attempts by the Ottomans to dominate the region were eliminated with the reconquest of the castle of Taraut or Al-Qatif in 1551. Archaeological finds are still being excavated from one of the Portuguese fortresses that served as a base to dominate the region as Rueda. The first representation of Qatar appears on the Portuguese map by Luís Lázaro in 1563, showing the city of Qatar as a fortress. Having retained a negligible military presence in the area, the Ottomans were expelled by the Bani Khalid tribe and their emirate in 1670. Bahraini and Saudi rule, 1783-1868. In 1766, members of the Al Khalifa family of the Utub tribal confederation migrated from Kuwait to Zubarah in Qatar. By the time of their arrival, the Bani Khalid exercised weak authority over the peninsula, notwithstanding the fact that the largest village was ruled by their distant kin. In 1783, Qatar-based Bani Utbah clans and allied Arab tribes invaded and annexed Bahrain from the Persians. The Al Khalifa imposed their authority over Bahrain and retained their jurisdiction over Zubarah. Following his swearing in as Crown Prince of the Wahhabi in 1788, Saud ibn Abd al-Aziz moved to expand Wahhabi territory eastward towards the Persian Gulf and Qatar. After defeating the Bani Khalid in 1795, the Wahhabi were attacked on two fronts. The Ottomans and Egyptians assaulted the western front, while the Al Khalifa in Bahrain and the Omanis launched an attack against the eastern front. Upon being made aware of the Egyptian advance on the western frontier in 1811, the Wahhabi emir reduced his garrisons in Bahrain and Zubarah in order to redeploy his troops. Said bin Sultan, ruler of Muscat, capitalized on this opportunity and raided the Wahhabi garrisons on the eastern coast, setting fire to the fort in Zubarah. The Al Khalifa was effectively returned to power thereafter. As punishment for piracy, an East India Company vessel bombarded Doha in 1821, destroying the town and forcing hundreds of residents to flee. In 1825, the House of Thani was established with Sheikh Mohammed bin Thani as the first leader. Although Qatar was considered a dependency of Bahrain, the Al Khalifa faced opposition from the local tribes. In 1867, the Al Khalifa, along with the ruler of Abu Dhabi, sent a massive naval force to Al Waqra in an effort to crush the Qatari rebels. This resulted in the maritime Qatari-Bahraini War of 1867-68, in which Bahraini and Abu Dhabi forces sacked and looted Doha and Al Waqra. The Bahraini hostilities were in violation of the Perpetual Truce of Peace and Friendship of 1861. The joint incursion, in addition to the Qatari counterattack, prompted British political resident, Colonel Louis Pelly to impose a settlement in 1868. His mission to Bahrain and Qatar and the resulting peace treaty were milestones because they implicitly recognized the distinctness of Qatar from Bahrain and explicitly acknowledged the position of Mohammed bin Thani. In addition to censuring Bahrain for its breach of agreement, Pelly negotiated with Qatari sheikhs who were represented by Mohammed bin Thani. The negotiations were the first stage in the development of Qatar as a sheikhdom. Ottoman period 1871-1915. Under military and political pressure from the governor of the Ottoman Vilayet of Baghdad, Midad Pasha, the ruling Al Thani tribe submitted to Ottoman rule in 1871. The Ottoman government imposed reformist Tanzimat measures concerning taxation and land registration to fully integrate these areas into the empire. Despite the disapproval of local tribes, Al Thani continued supporting the Ottoman rule. Qatari-Ottoman relations stagnated, and in 1882 they suffered further setbacks when the Ottomans refused to aid Al Thani in his expedition of Abu Dhabi-occupied Kar al-Udaid. In addition, the Ottomans supported the Ottoman subject Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, who attempted to supplant Al Thani as Kaymakam of Qatar in 1888. This eventually led Al Thani to rebel against the Ottomans, whom he believed were seeking to usurp control of the peninsula. He resigned as Kaymakam and stopped paying taxes in August 1892. In February 1893, Mehmed Hafiz Pasha arrived in Qatar in the interests of seeking unpaid taxes and accosting Jassim bin Muhammad's opposition to proposed Ottoman administrative reforms. Fearing that he would face death or imprisonment, Jassim retreated to Al-Wajba, 16 kilometers or 10 miles west of Doha, accompanied by several tribe members. Mehmed's demand that Jassim disband his troops and pledge his loyalty to the Ottomans was met with refusal. In March, Mehmed imprisoned Jassim's brother and 13 prominent Qatari tribal leaders on the Ottoman corvette Merak as punishment for his insubordination. After Mehmed declined an offer to release the captives for a fee of 10,000 liras, he ordered a column of approximately 200 troops to advance towards Jassim's Al-Wajba fort under the command of Yusuf Effendi, thus signaling the start of the Battle of Al-Wajba. Effendi's troops came under heavy gunfire by a sizable troop of Qatari infantry and cavalry shortly after arriving at Al-Wajba. They retreated to Shabaka fortress where they were again forced to draw back from a Qatari incursion. After they withdrew to Al-Bida fortress, Jassim's advancing column besieged the fortress, resulting in the Ottomans' concession of defeat and agreement to relinquish their captives in return for the safe passage of Mehmed Pasha's cavalry to Hafuf by land. Although Qatar did not gain full independence from the Ottoman Empire, the result of the battle forced a treaty that would later form the basis of Qatar's emerging as an autonomous country within the empire. British period, 1916–1971. By the Anglo-Ottoman Convention of 1913, the Ottomans agreed to renounce their claim to Qatar and withdraw their garrison from Doha. However, with the outbreak of World War I, nothing was done to carry this out, and the garrison remained in the fort at Doha, although its numbers dwindled as men deserted. In 1915, with the presence of British gunboats in the harbor, Abdullah bin Jassim Al Thani, who was pro-British, persuaded the remainder to abandon the fort, and when British troops approached the following morning they found it deserted. Qatar became a British protectorate on 3 November 1916-85 when the United Kingdom signed a treaty with Sheikh Abdullah bin Jassim Al Thani to bring Qatar under its trucial system of administration. The treaty reserved foreign affairs and defense to the United Kingdom but allowed internal autonomy. While Abdullah agreed not to enter into any relations with any other power without the prior consent of the British government, the latter guaranteed the protection of Qatar from aggression by sea and provide its good offices in the event of an attack by land. This latter undertaking was left deliberately vague. On 5 May 1935, while agreeing an oil concession with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, Abdullah signed another treaty with the British government which granted Qatar protection against internal and external threats. Oil reserves were first discovered in 1939. Exploitation and development were, however, delayed by World War II. The focus of British interests in Qatar changed after the Second World War with the independence of India, the creation of Pakistan in 1947, and the development of oil in Qatar. In 1949, the appointment of the first British political officer in Doha, John Wilton, signified a strengthening of Anglo-Qatari relations. Oil exports began in 1949, and oil revenues became the country's main source of revenue. The pearl trade had gone into decline. These revenues were used to fund the expansion and modernization of Qatar's infrastructure. When Britain officially announced in 1968 that it would withdraw from the Persian Gulf in 3 years' time, Qatar joined talks with Bahrain and 7 other trucial states to create a federation. Regional disputes, however, persuaded Qatar and Bahrain to withdraw from the talks and become independent states separate from the trucial states, which went on to become the United Arab Emirates. Independence and later, 1971–2000. Under an agreement with the United Kingdom, on 3 September 1971, the special treaty arrangements that were inconsistent with full international responsibility as a sovereign and independent state were terminated. The Emir of Qatar, after his father handed over power, Sheikh Tamim, has prioritized improving the domestic welfare of citizens, which includes establishing advanced healthcare and education systems, and expanding the country's infrastructure in preparation for the hosting of the 2022 World Cup. Qatar hosted the 2022 FIFA World Cup from the 21st of November to the 18th of December, becoming the first Arab and Muslim majority country to do so, and the third Asian country to host it following the 2002 FIFA World Cup in Japan and South Korea. Thank you for listening, friends. Keep support.